Welcome to Inspired Men Talk, 4 solution-focused therapists born in 4 different decades who openly and honestly discuss their perspectives on the issues surrounding men's mental health and the things that stigma says we don't talk about.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Inspired Men Talk. My name is Peter Ely. I'm a solution-focused hypnotherapist and I help people with fears and phobias and looking after their self-care. And with me as always is Ben Baker-Pollard. Good morning, Ben.
Throw me off, Pete. You don't normally come to me first. It's not
yeah.
Easy. Good morning, everyone. I'm Ben Baker-Pollard. I'm a solution-focused hypnotherapist as well. I'm also a policeman. And yeah, I do hopefully bring different perspectives with my experience from different walks in life.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ben. And Gary, I've given you a bit more time. Good morning, Gary.
Good morning. And I'm also a solution-focused hypnotherapist. I'm a solution-focused practitioner and trainer. And I guess my perspective is coming from that older generation. So hopefully I'm not going to look too old, but I might bring a different perspective. And, you know, it's all about the fun of it. So let's go.
Thank you very much, Gary. And today we have another fantastic guest, a really amazing, interesting individual. I'm going to jump straight in and say hello. Good morning, Ines Morgan.
Good morning, Peter. Thank you so much to yourself, Gary, Ben, and all of your listeners for having me on today.
Not a problem. Thank you for joining us. And so, Ines, what we like to do at the beginning of each podcast is get you to tell us a little bit about yourself. So would you be kind enough to introduce yourself to the listeners and to us and tell us a bit about yourself?
Okay, yeah, of course. I'll try and keep it short and sweet, but no promises there. So yeah, my name is Ines Morgan. I am a young person, so I'm only 20 years old, and I come from Dunnet Head, and I'm not sure if that's a place many of you or sort of, Gary, Peter, Ben, if you're familiar with.
No.
No, so we're near John O'Groats, and we are actually mainland Britain's most northerly point. And my favorite statistic with that is that we are closer to the International Space Station than we are to sort of Edinburgh and to London, and sort of the big sort of urban cities in the UK. And for context, it is an incredibly remote and rural community. If I want to get a Big Mac from McDonald's, that's, a 3-hour drive sort of one way, so a 6-hour round trip. And I suppose living in such I know, I can see your face there. It's, for those listening, Peter is looking rather shocked. And I think it's interesting because I don't think many people, and again, I would ask you three, realize that there's places on the UK mainland that are so remote.
When you told me that the very first time, that blew me away. I mean, I'm born in London, raised in London, and, I got in 3 hours, I can probably go to like 30 McDonald's, right? Walking. So that kind of blew me away. I never realized that McDonald's just was that didn't go that far up, right?
I was thinking about Uber Eats driver on his push bike.
I know. I have to say it's very cold by the time it reaches my house. But yeah, I think that's sort of where my story begins. Is I grew up and live sort of in this very remote community, and it's often, I guess, underrepresented and unseen within both decision making and just sort of the UK and sort of the country in general. And within my community, it's very interesting because you can imagine it's very fragile. The population is quite small and there's all sorts of pressures on it. But the majority of people work in the nuclear industry because I think in the 50s and 1960s, the UK government decided that they were going to plonk 2 nuclear reactors or 2 nuclear sites up in the far north, far away from everyone in London. So if anything went wrong, they would all be safe. But as a result of that, the vast majority of the population, the whole economy is reliant on the nuclear industry. And that is an industry that is in decline. And it is something that, growing up in my youth, I was very aware of. I would see family and friends leave my community, moving hundreds of miles away to never come back. I saw the local primary school shut. We saw, some of the highest levels of depopulation, not only within the UK, but actually within Europe. We're talking about losing over 20% of the population within 20 years, which is crazy. And so I was in school, primary school kid, and I felt that this was quite unjust. I felt on a personal level, it was unfair that my family and friends were leaving. It was unfair that I might have to move away. And it was really unfair that I didn't have access to the opportunities that other people did. Basic services like going to an orthodontist to get your braces, you didn't have that. You would have to travel the 3-6 hours away to access these things. And so I think I often trace the start of my journey back to then when I was in school. And I'd say I felt very scared because, everything I knew up until that point, my whole community, my whole life, it felt like it was under threat and it was in jeopardy. And I knew that when I reached the end of school, I would have to move away because there was a lack of opportunities, a lack of jobs, and a lack of avenues for young people like me. And that was really scary. And yeah, I think as a starting point, I was probably, maybe 7, 8 years old in primary school. And I did what I think all rational people would do. And I wrote a very angry letter to all of my local councillors. And I summoned them to coffee at my house. And I think the first mistake was probably writing a very angry letter. The second mistake was the fact I didn't tell my parents until all these councillors arrived. And I think that's a great anecdote because it perhaps, summarizes maybe my approach to all of this in the early days. It was quite sort of lackluster, just sort of like, knocking on any door I could to try and get an answer and to try and sort of like question people in authority about this issue. And what I realized as a result of that encounter was that, perhaps I should take a kinder tone and be more collaborative, but perhaps also I should tell my parents before I do these things. But what I also realized as well is that it wasn't these local councillors to blame for these issues, but actually it was a much more systemic question. It was much more about how does government, how does industry respond to the needs of communities and places that, they don't have to be rural ones like mine that are, hundreds of miles away from sort of decision makers in London or Edinburgh. But actually they can be communities that are, right in the shadows of Westminster that, are more urban as well. And so, yeah, that's kind of kickstarted this really weird, fascinating journey. And I suppose, long story short, sort of in my primary school and high school years, I did all sorts of weird and wacky things, from working on economic development bids, trying to drive sort of inward investment into communities, working with like nuclear developers and, renewable companies, to working on sort of policy making at sort of an international level, looking at the North Sea region and how we can improve sort of transport mobility and all these things, to working on developing the Rural Island Youth Parliament in Scotland, which is part of the Scottish Rural Island Parliament, which is, I think, definitely probably within Scotland, the largest grassroots sort of political assembly. So we bring together hundreds of people from across communities in Scotland, and we connect them to, decision makers, including, the First Minister, the Scottish Government, NGOs, and sort of all sorts of stakeholders within policymaking, to try and drive change and link the grassroots to the macro, if you like, and actually ensure better representation of people and communities. I've, done all sorts of weird things. And I suppose the reason I'm here today is probably because at the end of high school, I started reflecting and thinking about all of the things I'd been exposed to. I just questioned what actually, leads to social change within a particular community like mine, or within even an organization. What is that tipping point that, builds critical mass and actually enables positive outcomes and brings people together? And I thought about it for a while, and I had lots of ideas, but I tried to kind of simplify it into one word, which is purpose. And when I say purpose, to sort of, when I, tell that anecdote to people, they often kind of look at me like puzzled and think that I'm like trying to preach like a management consultant and say, we need more purpose. We need to sort of synergize things and, bring together the outputs and yada, yada, yada. But to me, it's not about that. It's more about, how do you as an individual understand your place within, your community, your organization? What piece do you play within that wider societal jigsaw? And then for organizations, it's exactly the same question. How can organizations positively contribute to society? What are the capabilities they have that can provide real positive value within communities and lead to sort of change? And how do we link all of these things together? How do we link up organizations to communities? How do we link up individuals to the organizations they work in? And so, yeah, got to the end of high school, had this realization, and thought, you know what, I'm going to do something about it. Or, well, I tried to do something about it. And so I created this nonprofit called Act with Purpose. And effectively, we are trying to promote this agenda. We work within sort of government and industry and also communities to think about how organizations and their leaders can become more purpose driven. So we've done work with the likes of the Cabinet Office, we've engaged with EY, tons of companies. I think to date we've probably engaged 50 plus companies and reached, thousands of people. And Lou Swain, who is the founder and managing director of this fantastic agency in London called Hug, their media agency. I reached out to him in the very early days of this project. I didn't know him. I'd heard of him because of his great work. And I asked him for help. I said to him, look, I haven't got a budget. And when I mean I don't have a budget, I mean I have no money. Can you please help me? And he very kindly did. And he's, been instrumental in sort of creating a brand, creating an identity, and helping kind of bring my vision to life. And it was Lou who very kindly introduced me to yourself, Peter. And I guess that is why I'm here today. So yeah, fast forward to now, I'm running Out with Purpose. I'm a student down in Cambridge, which feels very strange coming from somewhere so far north. I do a ton of other, again, weird and wacky things. I sit on the board of a eating disorder charity in Scotland. I sit on a ministerial steering group with the Scottish government, a regional sort of tourism group. Yeah, so got my fingers in lots of pies, as they say. But yeah, I guess that's the summary. I appreciate I've probably taken about 20 minutes to say that, but there you go.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you very much. I don't know about the other two gents, but I feel very inadequate now, right? At 20, I kind of was sitting in a pub having a beer. I'd never even heard of who my cabinet minister was. So
I do that too, don't worry.
It's amazing because, again, I mean, most of us are city-centric in different ways. I come from South London originally, although I'm now near to where you are. But like Peter, if I want something, I literally walk out the door and I get it. And we talk about, I work a lot in East Anglia, and it's like, oh, they have to get 20 minutes to get a pint of milk, and that's a big thing. So what you sort of are used to is very different to population. So I can see where that, even anger from what you saw had, but being so young to do it. But what fascinates me is you're at Cambridge University. How did you fit in being able to do GCSEs and A levels and qualified to get into such a prestigious university, as well as do all that other stuff? Most teenagers are focused on one or two things, and that's hard work for them. You're going, I'm going to qualify to go to one of the leading universities in the world, while I'm still going to be aggravating anybody who I can pin down and listen about their inadequacies. I'm not sure whether I'm a little bit intimidated by what you've done or massively inspired.
Yeah, thank you. It's an interesting point. I think I definitely would say I'm relentless on the advocacy, the campaigning front. To give you, I've talked about the councillor story, but to give you another one, I lived in London last year. I was sort of the gap year after school, and I was doing some work in Parliament. And one of the most senior civil servants in the country, who was leading a department in government, he got on the same tube stop as me. He must, I don't know, happen to live near where I was living. And whenever I would see him, I think he probably hated my guts, because I think pester is probably the wrong word, but I would always go and try and strike a conversation with him and talk about sort of the issues of today from sort of the people I was speaking to and things. But yeah, it's a really kind thing for you to say and comment on. And I think it probably goes for me, if I didn't do well in school, I wouldn't have this opportunity here. And I think I'm, in a sense, fighting for more opportunities from like the younger version of myself, and more kind of routes and avenues I could have taken. But I think I almost see coming here to Cambridge and sort of, working hard in school as being part of that journey, as being part of like trying to gain more opportunity. It sounds kind of weird, but almost to gain more opportunities for myself to then be able to talk about the things that matter to me and the other people that I speak to and who are also on this journey with me. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's a big kind of, I never thought about it in that way before.
Cool. So I want to take you back a little bit, if I may. Number one, how did mum and dad react when all of those counsellors turned up? Because I know my nan would have just beaten me and then made them a cup of tea. How did mum and dad react to it?
So I think I will be honest, it was a bit of shock horror, but they kind of expected that sort of thing for me. So it's probably worth contextualizing this with probably doesn't paint me in a great light, but I used to have this obsession with ferries. I don't know, I was just like a young kid. I love ferries. And obviously living sort of in the North Coast, we've got the Orkney Islands and stuff, and there's ferries that go to and fro. And there's always, I guess, I don't know, probably in all of my living memory, there's been an issue with ferries in Scotland. There's a famous scandal going on, or an infamous scandal going on.
Can we just clarify, because of your wonderful accent, you mean boats?
Yes, sorry. Yeah, not ferries.
It sounds like you're saying fairies when you're talking about it. I'm like, fairies? Where do fairies come into it?
That's
we would have gone with that too, because we, whatever. But I just wanted to clarify for the you mean a boat?
Yeah, you probably thought I was absolutely nuts there. Yeah, I mean ferries. Ferry. Ferries is in the boat, not the, I would say, mythical creatures, but I don't know if that will offend anyone. Hopefully you've not got too many younger listeners. But yeah, so I had this sort of weird obsession with ferries, and the government weren't doing, or the people sort of running them weren't doing a very good job at that time, and they continue to kind of fail. You'll see famously, sort of infamously, rather, in Scotland, it's a big issue. And so the government put out sort of this notice, and they were inviting people to bid to run the ferries. And I went on to my parents' eBay account and I put in a bid for a yacht. And I can't remember how much the yacht was, but it was quite expensive. And they had to obviously cancel or pull out the bid. I don't know. But that's sort of, again, I was kind of prone to doing things that were a little bit wacky. So I guess in this case, they were happy that no finances were involved, as much as they did have a counselor or two at the door who were a little bit confused. There was no monetary kind of exchange there. So they were, I mean, not best pleased, but they got over it. And they've been enormously supportive over the years, but I think they're sadly probably adjusted to this reality. I must clarify, I think I'm a lot more mature maybe in my methods now. I'd like to hope. Anyway.
Excellent.
It sounds like the methods were great. I mean, I wouldn't worry about being mature. That actually that action gets taken because you started the ball rolling whether they wanted it or not. So fantastic. That's so good.
And so, oh, go on, Ben. Sorry.
I was going to say, it is all the stuff you've been doing since you've been a kid to where you are now. What's the biggest challenge for you on a personal level been? Is in terms of, obviously we're about Inspired Men Talk. We look at men's mental health as a predominant factor. Have you struggled with anything? Because there have been challenges that you've had to overcome?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I think coming sort of onto this podcast, it's weird because I think a lot of the time, it sounds very cliche, but because I've done this for all of my living memory, I don't really know any different. And it's not until I've actually probably started reflecting on it recently that I've maybe kind of thought about some of the challenges that actually I've kind of faced and just sort of shaped me for, both good and bad reasons. And so I think compared to your other guests, to go back to the word mature, I'd say I'm probably less mature sort of in that kind of phase of maybe understanding what these issues and, what these opportunities are and maybe addressing them. But to give you, a couple, I think, one I had in the past and I continue to have is the issue of rejection. I think doing what I'm doing, and again, it's not unique to me, everyone will experience it, but you face a lot of rejection. And sometimes it will be something as simple as you send an email and never get a response. Sometimes it will be you send an email and get a very bad response. Sometimes it will be you're in a meeting. I remember being quite young and being in sort of a meeting and saying something. I was representing sort of an organization at that time. And we were looking at effectively how we could, bring together the capabilities of different sort of organizations to actually create some common good. And I remember there was, a stakeholder or two who were, significantly older than me, and they, for various reasons were kind of opposed to this sort of idea for change, and just them being quite aggressive and that being quite disheartening, maybe scary. And so I think rejection is obviously an issue. In terms of how I've dealt with that, I feel like I have a strong sense of purpose. And again, that sounds cliche, but I think because I have maybe not a direction of travel, I guess some direction of travel, I have some sort of degree of understanding of what value I provide and what value I'd like to provide. I think it's easier to get over rejection because I sort of am focused on, I'm going to make this happen, or this is going to happen either way. And like, I will just find another alternative to make it happen. So I think rejection is probably something that in the past, like as a young kid, I was really sensitive to it. I would even positive feedback, I would cry. It was really difficult. Whereas now I would say I can be very like transactional. Again, is probably the wrong word to use, but I can just be I'm better at dealing with that. I would say another thing that's perhaps more challenging, and again, I'd be open to suggestions on this one because I guess it's a live, raw issue, is the idea of my identity sometimes being dislocated. Because, on one hand, I'm from this really rural community, but on the other hand, I'm here in Cambridge, but I'm also, working with community groups, but I'm also speaking to ministers and advising ministers and attending these very, very cool events. And sometimes I suppose it can feel like in trying to bridge the two worlds, sometimes you don't fall into either one of those camps. So yeah, so I guess that's kind of like the two sort of biggest ones that I see, but there's probably a lot more that I'm just not aware of because they're so intrinsically shaped within me that actually I don't notice them. But I guess on sort of that idea of there being two bridges, I think that's challenging, right? Because you feel like sometimes you don't belong necessarily into either one of these spheres, and sometimes you have to act in certain ways and like you have to be very conscious and methodical about how you're behaving. And like that requires a lot of thought, a lot of consciousness. And yeah, that can be difficult.
So I'm going to bring that question back to you a little bit because you said you might, open to suggestions. How do you cope with it? What do you do now to deal with it?
Yeah, I guess what do I do in the present? Yeah, it's a good question. I think it does go back to that purpose. And again, I probably used the word cliche probably about 10 times now, but I think because I understand now that there's value in doing this work, that there's value in, even if the impact's small, there's value in doing something in this space. I think I know that I have a role within both of those spheres. I know that, within my community that I'm not, Innes as a person is of course the work I do, but it's also like who I am as an individual, the relationships I have, the people I know, my behavior is sort of like my values and all those things. And my purpose is not like intrinsically linked to just this work. And so I think just recognizing the fact that actually almost spinning it on its head and seeing it as an opportunity, like it's a huge, huge privilege that I'm able to be exposed to both of these things. And I never thought I would, but I think it's to be sort of at the table with these really senior government stakeholders and then to be able to go home to my community and just be me as well. Like that is, as much as it is dislocating, it's a huge privilege. And just being grateful. I think gratitude is definitely a big thing in this. I think throughout sort of all of these challenges, just being grateful for the opportunities I've had and being grateful for the platform that, I'm able to speak from is enormously helpful. I don't know, there's probably some sciencey thing that you, again, will know a lot more than I do around how sort of like gratitude kind of like can tackle some of these, I don't know, hormones or whatever they are. But I think, gratitude is definitely one. And just actually, going back to basics and just thinking about purpose. And actually, sometimes it's almost, you can complicate these things yourself. It's almost that whole thing of like outsider sort of imposter syndrome. And actually, sometimes that's an illusion. And people see you, I see all of you as sort of like the people you are. And I don't kind of like question sort of like the roles you play. And so actually, sometimes you just have to, move beyond sort of that veil.
Yeah, what you're saying is something we teach. You know, so we're talking about keeping that intellectual mind in control and looking at it from a informed perspective rather than with all the emotional and kind of doubt and negative kind of spin on life. Because actually, if we keep it upstairs, then we actually can succeed and find ways of overcoming it or be comfortable with who we are. And you're right, there is something in gratitude. We word it slightly differently because with gratitude, we can also have a negative attachment to it as well. We can be grateful for something, but it could be negative. So all we do is we advise people to say, focus on what's been good in your day. Make a note of it, the simplest thing. Each day, write down a couple of bullet points, what's been good. And that can be simplest from I got up, I got dressed and had a shower if it's a tough time. Or it could be that I met up with friends, we went out and we went and watched a movie, or I had a great meeting with the MPs and I really succeeded in getting my point across. But it is remembering to appreciate the value in the small, simple things in life because they are equally as important as the bigger successes that we have. And if we focus on that chemically in the brain, we get a fantastic reward that helps us cope with those challenges that we face in day-to-day life.
Yeah, and I think it's a very good point as well, because sometimes gratitude is hard, particularly when you maybe set high expectations on you and other people, and you want them to perform, or you want a specific output, and actually you don't get that. But actually just being grateful for sort of the small blessings as they are, and the small wins, and actually how, you know, progress is not linear. It's kind of this, I don't know what the graph is, but you know, it goes up and down. But over time, it's sort of, it gets better. I think that other reflection I would have on that, you've sort of just inspired me there actually, is I often like to think of, you know, every relationship I have is almost like a plant within a garden, and they're all different, they're all diverse, but together it creates this really beautiful ecosystem. And you can't set expectations on some of these flowers and plants, and sometimes, you know, they grow in certain ways that you wouldn't expect. But actually, just putting in energy, just watering them and giving sort of them what they need, and they all need different things, right? But just not expecting them all to be the same. And yeah, each person I meet, and you know, each organization and stakeholder, I feel like they all add something different to this really beautiful ecosystem. But yeah, just being grateful for that.
I'm definitely stealing that.
Yeah, really nice analogy. I really
Yeah.
like.
I've probably stolen that from subconsciously from, like, I don't know, TikTok or something, but I use it anyway.
No, definitely.
I think I've got a language pattern which says that. Peter, you've got you've got lots of questions, and I've got a few questions as well. So you ask yours, and then I've got a couple of questions.
I was going to ask. I imagine moving in, like coming into Cambridge, it's going to be a lot more populated, a lot more densely populated than where you've grown up and where you've kind of lived your life. How did you cope with that transition?
Yeah. So I guess actually the more stark one was when I lived in London for a couple of months just before coming to Cambridge. And I literally moved on my own. I don't know, was what, 17, 18. And I think, yeah, at first it was very overwhelming. What was probably more challenging in London, more so than Cambridge, is that I didn't really know anyone in London. You know, I was young, I was working a full-time job, and I didn't have the traditional kind of like social bases that maybe you have when you're sort of, you know, moving into a new school, when you're going to university, and those kind of frameworks that you can build off and meet people and have those relationships. And I guess actually maybe for your listeners, that's more relatable, right? If you move to a new town or city, because, you know, if you start a new job, you know, that is a social base, but it's not the same as starting a new school or starting university, or, you know, going into any kind of form of like traditional training or something like that. You have to start afresh. And so that was challenging. I guess I was working, and maybe at the time I didn't realize that I was lonely. And I was never truly lonely in that sense, but I guess I didn't have many friends there. And my life sort of revolved around the work I was doing. And because I, you know, saw meaning in that and I was enjoying that, that was fine. But it definitely was at times quite isolating. I think what helped with that is actually building routine. And I don't mean building routine as in, you know, getting up every day and sort of like having porridge for breakfast, but I more mean going to the same places and actually building relationships up with people. And so for me, it was actually going to the gym, and going to this particular gym box in Victoria. I managed to build these micro relationships with the staff. So be that the person at reception, be that sort of the person who was leading the class. And over time, that really helps, because actually at the start it's hard, and I had that issue of setting expectations. I was like, I need to find friends, like sort of like desperate to, grab onto anything that was coming my way. But actually over time, I realized that it kind of was this organic process. And, to go back to that garden metaphor, like if you, plant loads of seeds, something's bound to grow. And over time, I guess that garden built. But yeah, it was challenging. And I think building routine, going to the gym, committing myself to these things was definitely helpful. And just, that was, definitely a cornerstone of sort of my strategy. But yeah, isolating at times.
It's fantastic because when this started, I was thinking there was a quote that's attributed to Robin Williams, and he said, like, the worst thing, it's one thing to feel alone when you're on your own, he said, but it's much worse being alone in a room full of people, or feeling alone in a room full of people. And I love the fact that, you're in a city full of people and you found a way to actually not feel alone by making those connections.
Well, first of all, that's such an important thing for our listeners to understand, because I think many people that I've spoken to over the years doing this role have felt that loneliness amongst being in a room full of people. And it's like, how do you actively learn to interact with people? And that can be quite a big thing for people to learn to start building their own network of friends and colleagues and interactions. So thank you for sharing that. My questions are, well, there's two questions. So the first one is, how, you've got such a strong purpose, strong desire to make such a big difference, but you also on the younger side of most people who come on the pod. I think you may be the youngest person we've had. How do you stop distractions getting away? You're at university, and my experience of universities, there's lots of distractions, alcohol and everything else, and just being life, there's lots of distractions. How do you stay committed to your purpose and not be distracted?
These are tough questions. And again, a very one. I think purpose for me, as much as I'm kind of like resolute and I've got kind of a clear focus, I think it does change and shift with times as sort of you embrace new ideas, you meet new people, and you stumble across new things. But I think having it as a thread throughout your life and as like a continuity point, it goes back to sort of what we were saying around routine. Like for me, perhaps it's easier because for all of my life I've done these things and I've kind of been bound by this idea. And so the idea of not doing it is actually quite crazy. And, there might have been points that I've considered stopping and I've been distracted by other things, but actually you always find your way back to these things. And I'm sure for your listeners as well, whether or not you have a clear sense of you feel like you've got a clear sense of purpose. I think everyone does have that deep felt sort of like convictions within them that maybe they've just not surfaced yet, but actually they hold true. I was speaking to someone the other day who was telling me that they actually didn't understand, they thought they didn't believe in anything. They didn't think they believed in God. They didn't think they had political views or had any real strong convictions in that way. But it wasn't until 9/11 happened that actually they realized, crikey, I actually do believe things. I actually do have these convictions, and it did come to the surface, and actually there was some meaning there. And even though sort of, I don't know if they were directly affected by 9/11, but actually sometimes it just takes events like that to sort of, to ground you in your, I don't know, inner state of consciousness and being. But yeah, to answer your question, I think for me, it's always been a point of continuity. And, where there's been maybe temptations to drift away, I think I always try and balance it because I'm always focused on the output of this. And even if I only have a small impact, I think just being focused on that is, really important.
Well, that's a really good answer, and how important purpose is to drive our futures and drive our decision makers. So that's great. The other question I got, again, maybe difficult, maybe easy for you to answer. We've mentioned a few times, you've mentioned a few times, you're 20, you've been doing this all your life, which is not many years. So you started inviting counsellors around when you was from most people's words, a child, and you're inviting people around and you're trying to buy boats on your parents' eBay. So you've always had this strong sense of purpose, but you've been a young man. but you've been a young man from a tiny community, which nobody's heard of. You're Scottish, which you're now in England. So how do you deal with the stigma of being a young person who's trying to deal with people who might have a really strong bias against Scottish, against young, against this, almost bigots? How do you deal with that? Because in my head, this is something you're running across every day. When I look at the space you're trying to impact, all I see is people who have their own agenda and their own bigotry, and their own stigma.
Oh, actually, I like this question because I think my strategies change with time. I think when I was, in the early days, I was probably quite, again, resolute and kind of aggressive is the wrong word, but I was, steadfast. I was kind of like pushing people. I was, saying what needed to be said, perhaps maybe in ways that could have been more diluted, maybe for sort of the political people I was dealing with and the policymakers and things. So I think I started that way, but I tried to become more collaborative, and that was, good on the whole. But you're definitely right in saying it was difficult. And I, to use that example again, being shouted down at meetings. I remember being on the phone. I remember a couple of phone calls like this with, after, several emails to the CEO of this company. I wanted to talk about sort of the ideas I had for them and how I think, by making a few small changes, they could have a huge impact in my view, but from what I saw. And I just remember, words to the effect of, you're not going to change the world, who are you, sort of thing. And at that time, I kind of just went back into a hole and sort of ignored it and just moved on to the next person. But I almost wish in retrospect that I stood up for myself more because, I never set out to change the world. I just set out to maybe change my small part of it or to make a small difference within my own community. And so I think with time, I've become more focused on actually just dealing with people who maybe are more aligned and sympathetic to what I'm talking about. But that doesn't mean that I kind of avoid having hard conversations. But I think particularly within government and industry, like this agenda that I'm working on, you have to sometimes confront these biases. You sometimes have to confront these ideas because these are the people who are pulling the levers and who are in charge and who have the authority and have the resources and have the capabilities to make a change. And so without them on board, you can't really do much. Sometimes, it's about confronting. Sometimes it's about trying to work with them. Sometimes it's about trying to pose things in their terms and sort of use their language. But I would say on the whole, I just try and be as well researched as I can. I try to make, the absolute best impression I can with these people. I try to be, as professional as I can. And I try to just tackle sort of every stereotype they could have of me, head on. Definitely, it's still an issue. And even today, like on a daily, I'm sure it kind of affects my life. But you just have to find ways around it. You have to, tackle the stereotypes head on. Sometimes I think on the whole, I try to be sort of like, very professional about it, but sometimes you really do kind of just want to I don't know, not cry, but it's hard. Yeah. So that's probably the takeaway. It's hard.
I mean, what I've just heard is you confront those challenges, and they come in many forms of bias and stigma. You confront it with not walking in there blind, not walking in there, and you don't bend to the stereotype. You don't go, oh, this is what you expect, I'll be what you want me to be. You're not trying to appease people, and you're forcing people not to appease you, because I guess there's a lot of there, just say whatever he wants to, he goes away, and you keep turning up. So I think that's really powerful.
Yeah. And persistence is definitely, is the thing, keep knocking, keep emailing.
I think that's important. But I tell you what I'm hearing over and over again, and you haven't said the word, but I'm hearing it all of the time with this, is resilience. It's really hard to be persistent if you don't have that resilience, and that purpose in those values is what informs that resilience. I don't know what the other guys think.
Well, I was actually going to say that there was an episode of Doogie Howser. You reminded me. You won't have heard of this show. It's called Doogie
Okay.
Howser MD, and it was about a kid who became a doctor. And in one of the episodes, he was facing this pressure because he was young. And at
Mhm.
the end of it, he said, I will not always be young. And unfortunately, it's true. But at some point, you're going to get to the point where everyone will look at you as an equal and not as that young person, which will give you even more power because you'll have gone through that and still have that resilience. So, I think that's amazing. Ben, have you got anything you wanted to say?
I think you demonstrate resilience in everything you talk about. For someone who's come from a little remote place in Scotland, that's probably just fields and animals, that your main interaction is with, bar the local residents, to being in Cambridge, going to London and meeting the people that you are speaking to at the level you're speaking to. You demonstrate resilience in everything you do. I think you're a really inspiring young guy who is probably more switched on about the world and things that you want to achieve and do than a lot of the grown-ups in the world. It's a clear demonstration that actually, and we see this in a lot of entrepreneurs and people who succeed in the world, is that it doesn't matter where you come from or what your upbringing being, but when you find access to that ability to be resilient and your determination to not accept no and to keep knocking on people's doors, no matter how many times you get knocked down, you get back up again. And you learn from the times that you do get knocked down and the doors that are closed in your face, and it shapes you to be a formidable character and somebody who will clearly be very successful in their life. So yeah, I think you're an absolute inspiration.
Thank you. No, I mean, it means a lot. And I really appreciate it. And I think it's very true to say that, what's the saying? Is it resilience or beats natural talent any day of the week? I wouldn't say I'm naturally gifted at many things. In fact, I actually learned recently that I think I'm apparently dyslexic, which almost surprised me because I'm here studying politics, writing essays. Yeah, I think it's that resilience. Yeah, I've never thought about it in that way, but it's definitely perhaps true.
It's really important. And I mean, I think when we understand ourselves, and I mean, we've talked about it before on this call and privately, we talk about people's self-awareness. Most people don't have much self-awareness or emotional intelligence. People talk about themselves having plenty, and then you go in, well, you don't have that much really, or they're not very mindful, even though they want to be mindful and they promote themselves. All I'm hearing is your self-awareness, which then gives, and they come from those values, and you know what your values are. You're aware of who you are. You're aware of how old you are, and the fact that you've got to step into, for a better word, the lion's den of middle-aged white people or have people who have an agenda, and you're trying to spoil their fun or their outcomes by being practical. And one of the things I hear a lot, a lovely saying I like, is you need to be more childlike and less childish. Most MPs, most people of my generation become quite childish, and we can't see with the wonder of those childlike eyes. So that youth you've got can see things clearly, and you say it how it is without the cloud of I've got to now do this, and I've got to appease these people and please those people, and I've got to reach this agenda, which is very selfish. So your self-awareness, your emotional intelligence just shines through, and you're sticking to your core values is so important, because that drives you and gives you that ability to get up when you've been knocked down and keep that resilience and persistence going. So I'm loving what I'm hearing. I don't know where you're going to go. I don't know where you're going to get to, but wow. And I think this is such a valuable podcast for people to listen to who are struggling with their own goals, their own outcomes they're trying to create, and they're not able to stay loyal to their own values because they feel pressure from everybody else's. And you're not getting the pressure from everybody else's. You're going, yes, but this is what I need to do. And I'm very inspired by that. So well done, guys.
So before I kind of hand over and give you the chance to tell us more about Act with Purpose, I have one last question. Your journey started because you wanted to look at how you could help your community. And although it's still only a really short journey, right, in terms of linear time, what changes or what things have you seen that have benefited your community from the work that you've done so far? And where do you want it to go to?
Oh, yeah. Again, a good one. I think on the impact space, what's maybe changed is the way I view community and the level I view community. You know, at the start, I was kind of like, I want to, bring in, jobs, opportunities to my place and do these things. And it's been, great to be involved in work that's, led to those kinds of effects and to support causes and initiatives that have done that. But actually, I think as I've gotten older or, matured a little bit, I think I've realized the gap maybe is more in how, the big senior decision makers in government identify with these issues and how within organizations we can, make small changes, incremental changes that have huge effects on society. And so in that space, I think it's hard to, again, I think one thing that I'm quite hard on myself on is actually trying to be tangible about that impact, because I think I'm driven ultimately by tangible impacts. If I go back to sort of that early example of like, I want to see jobs and opportunities created in my place, but actually I think the changes I've seen have been maybe more in mindsets and more in the way that particular organizations and particular, ministers and senior civil servants go about their work. And I think it's hard to quantify what that looks like. And I mean, like, of course, I can spit off kind of numbers that don't really make much sense about like, we've reached, 10,000 people and, engaged 50 plus organizations, but actually it's hard to, what I would like to do more of is actually storytelling around these individual organizations and these leaders to actually, because it's hard to quantify what that impact looks like. But I guess going forwards, I think I would, of course, I think both are important, the grassroots, change, seeing jobs, opportunities and things, but also the mindsets and sort of the macro level strategy stuff is important. I think I'd like to see, again, it sounds quite fluffy, but I would like to move to a space where organizations can better come together when we think about social value. So, most organizations do corporate social responsibility, they do environmental social governance, they have all these initiatives, that show that they're sustainable, that they're good for the planet, that they're good for communities. But actually thinking about how we can tie together some of these benefits would be really powerful, I think. So maybe it's a case that Microsoft, have these vast amounts of, technological innovations and all this great data that maybe when paired with a charity, they could do some really fantastic work. So I actually think bringing people together in that space would be, that's where I think I'd like to go, but we'll see.
Excellent. So we've kind of come to near the end of our time, and this is where we give you the opportunity to tell us about what you're doing, tell us a bit about Act with Purpose, how people can contact you, etc. So would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
You've heard a little bit about sort of the origin story of Act with Purpose, what we're about, who we are, our agenda, and what we're rooted in. And so over the past couple of years, it's been a huge learning curve. I've learned a ton, and the direction, I don't want to say it's always changing because that implies that it's very volatile, but I think we're constantly adapting to changing circumstances. But the bulk of our work just now is focused on building leadership capability within both the civil service and industry around the idea of purpose. So what does it mean to be a purpose-driven leader for both your organization, for yourself as an individual, and for the communities and demographics and society you serve? So we do a lot of work in that space. And we also do a lot of work within sort of a system space, thinking about how organizations can integrate better, how they can think about corporate social responsibility, how they can think about and measure their impact in different novel ways that are better for society. And so if your listeners as individuals are interested in learning more about our work and contributing to our network and our community, be that through insights or coming along to our events, that would be absolutely fantastic. Or equally, if they're interested from an organizational perspective in getting some of those insights or working with us on some of these projects, that would be great. And you can do so by reaching out to me at www.actwithpurpose.org.
Fantastic. Innes, it's been a genuine pleasure chatting with you and learning about your story. You've brought so many fascinating concepts to light, and it's amazing to see that young people aren't what I was, which was a little bit of a booze hound and a football player. It's lovely to see that young people actually do take care of the environment and do care about these things. So thank you for coming on and talking with us today. Gents, would you like to say thank you and goodbye?
Yeah, cool. Again, Innes, like I said, really inspiring, mate. You're phenomenal for where you come from to where you're at, and I'm sure you're one to watch and see where you progress to as the future continues, which I'm looking forward to keeping track of. And thanks for coming on the podcast. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, and for me, a massive thank you. Very inspiring. And again, like Ben just said, one to watch. I'd like to see where you end up. And massive good luck doing your degree. That's got to be some hard work, and you're going to smash it by the sounds of it. So well done, and stay in contact. You're only down the road from where I am. It would be nice to speak to you again. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you both so much, and to all of you and to your listeners as well. It's been a huge privilege, and really appreciate the opportunity.
So thank you for listening to Inspired Men Talk. I hope you learned some great stuff there from Innes. And if you've got any feedback for us, please reach out and we can talk about how you can make an impact for your community. Until the next time, take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the podcast that proves men do talk.
If you would like more information or support, then please visit inspiredtochange.biz,
where you can learn more about us and the Inspired to Change team.
And remember, the conversation continues on our social media at Inspired Men Talk.